A boy faces his fears as he tries to save a wolf with its paw caught in a trap. With every move, the danger grew, but what the wolf did next left everyone in disbelief. In the shadows of Wyoming's Shoshone National Forest, where the untamed wilderness met civilization's tentative grasp, 14-year-old Ethan Mitchell stood at his bedroom window, watching the first light of dawn paint the snow-covered mountains. The ancient ranch house creaked beneath his feet, a reminder of both its age and the weight of responsibility that had settled over their lives since his father's departure to distant shores for a long-term research expedition. The sound of his mother Sarah's footsteps in the kitchen below drew his attention away from the mesmerizing landscape. The aroma of coffee and fresh-baked bread wafted up through the floorboards, a daily ritual that somehow made their challenging life feel more manageable. Ethan grabbed his worn jacket from the hook behind his door, knowing the morning chores wouldn't wait. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Stay tuned for more. "Morning, Mum," he called out, descending the stairs 2 at a time. Sarah turned from the stove, her smile warm but tired. The ranch demanded everything from them, and some days it felt like they were barely keeping their heads above water. "There's fresh bread on the table," she said, pouring coffee into her favorite chipped mug. "And don't forget to check the fence line today. That last storm might have brought down some branches." Ethan nodded, already spreading butter on a thick slice of bread. Through the kitchen window, he could see the edge of the forest looming beyond their property. Something about it seemed different lately, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what had changed. The ancient pines stood as they always had, their branches heavy with snow, but there was an tension in the air that hadn't been there before. "Mom," he began, hesitating slightly, "have you noticed anything strange about the forest lately?" Sarah's hands stilled for a moment before she continued washing dishes, her back to him. "Strange how?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I don't know exactly, just different. Like someone's been out there." Ethan watched his mother's shoulders tense slightly. "Yesterday, when I was collecting firewood, I found some weird markings on the trees, and there were these odd depressions in the snow, like—" "Ethan," Sarah interrupted, turning to face him, "the forest is vast, and there are plenty of legitimate reasons for people to be out there. Rangers, researchers, photographers. It's nothing for you to worry about." But Ethan could see the worry lines around her eyes, the way she glanced quickly at the forest before turning back to her tasks. She knew something, but whatever it was, she wasn't sharing it with him. After breakfast, Ethan headed out to begin his chores. The bitter Wyoming wind bit through his jacket as he made his way to the barn, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The horses nickered softly as he entered, their breath visible in the cold morning air. As he worked, Ethan's mind wandered to the changes he'd been noticing. It wasn't just the marked trees or the strange tracks. There was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up whenever he ventured too close to the tree line. The forest had always been mysterious, but lately it felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Near midday, while checking the fence line as his mother had asked, Ethan found something that made his heart skip a beat. Half hidden in the snow was a strange metal contraption, its jaws closed on empty air. A trap, and not the kind used by legitimate hunters or researchers. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't be there. Careful not to touch it, Ethan studied the device. It was new, recently placed, and professionally made. Whoever had put it there knew what they were doing. The discovery confirmed his suspicions. Someone was definitely in their forest, and they weren't there for any good reason. The sound of branches cracking in the forest made him freeze. Slowly, Ethan turned toward the noise, his eyes scanning the trees. For a moment he could have sworn he saw something moving among the shadows, something large and grey. But when he blinked, whatever it was had vanished. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table doing his homework, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. Sarah moved around the kitchen, humming softly to herself, but he noticed how she kept glancing out the window as darkness fell, as if expecting to see something or someone emerging from the forest. "Mom," he said finally, closing his textbook, "what aren't you telling me about what's happening in the forest?" Sarah paused in her cooking, and for a moment Ethan thought she might finally tell him the truth. But she just shook her head and smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sometimes, honey, it's better not to know everything. Just promise me you'll be careful, especially near the forest." That night, as Ethan lay in bed listening to the wind howl outside his window, he made a decision. Whatever was happening in their forest, he was going to find out. The trap he'd found was just the beginning. There had to be more. And somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness that surrounded their ranch, something or someone was waiting to be discovered. A long, mournful howl echoed through the night, closer than any wolf had ever come to the ranch before. Ethan sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The howl came again, and this time he could have sworn it sounded like a call, not of hunger or aggression, but of loneliness and need. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin his investigation in earnest. The forest was hiding secrets, and somehow he knew that uncovering them would change his life forever. As he drifted off to sleep, the howling continued, a haunting melody that seemed to speak directly to his soul, promising adventures and mysteries yet to come. The next morning dawned with an unusual stillness that seemed to blanket the entire ranch. Ethan woke before his alarm, his mind still filled with the haunting howls from the previous night. As he dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, he could hear his mother's voice drifting up from downstairs. She was speaking to someone in hushed, urgent tones. Creeping halfway down the stairs, Ethan strained to listen. Through the crack in the doorway, he could see Sarah pacing the kitchen, her cell phone pressed to her ear. "No, you don't understand," she was saying, her voice tight with worry. "They're getting closer to the ranch. I found 3 more of those. Things yesterday." She paused, listening. "I know you're doing what you can, Tom, but these people, they're not just ordinary." She stopped abruptly, noticing Ethan's shadow on the stairs. "I have to go," she said quickly, ending the call. When Ethan entered the kitchen, she was already busying herself with breakfast preparations, acting as if nothing had happened. "Who was that?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual as he poured himself a glass of orange juice. "Just Tom from the Forest Service," Sarah replied, not meeting his eyes, "checking in about the winter conditions." Ethan knew she was lying. In all his 14 years, he'd never known his mother to be anything but honest with him. Whatever was happening must be serious enough to change that. After breakfast, Ethan headed out to collect firewood, but this time he had a different plan in mind. Instead of staying near the ranch's border, he ventured deeper into the forest, following the trail where he'd found the trap yesterday. The morning sun filtered through the pine branches, creating shifting patterns on the snow-covered ground. He hadn't gone far when he spotted another trap, this one partially hidden under fresh snow. Nearby, he noticed something odd, large paw prints circling the area, as if some animal had been investigating the trap itself. The prints were massive, unlike anything he'd seen before. A twig snapped somewhere behind him. Ethan spun around, his heart thundering in his chest. Through the trees, he caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of grey fur. Without thinking, he took a step forward. "Hello," he called softly, immediately feeling foolish for talking to what was probably just a deer or elk. But the movement stopped, and slowly, deliberately, a massive form emerged from behind a thick pine trunk. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Less than 20 feet away stood the largest wolf he'd ever seen. Its coat was a mixture of silver and grey, and its eyes, amber and intelligent, fixed directly on him. But what struck Ethan most wasn't the wolf's size, or even its unexpected appearance. It was the way it was looking at him, with what seemed like curiosity rather than aggression. Neither moved for what felt like an eternity. The wolf's head tilted slightly, studying him. Despite everything he'd ever been taught about wild animals, Ethan didn't feel afraid. There was something about this creature that seemed different, almost familiar. The wolf took a step forward, and Ethan noticed it was favoring its right front paw. A dark stain matted the fur just above its foot, an injury possibly from one of the traps. The animal's eyes moved from Ethan to the trap in the snow, then back to Ethan, as if trying to communicate something. "Are you hurt?" Ethan said softly, taking a cautious step forward. The wolf didn't retreat. Instead, it sat down in the snow, still watching him intently. This behavior was so unlike anything Ethan had ever heard about wolves that he began to wonder if he was dreaming. A distant sound, voices carrying through the crisp morning air, broke the spell. The wolf's ears pricked forward and its body tensed. Before Ethan could react, it had disappeared into the forest, leaving only its tracks in the snow as evidence of their encounter. Ethan hurried back to the ranch, his mind racing. He wanted to tell his mother about what he'd seen, but something held him back. The wolf's behavior, the trap, his mother's secret phone conversation, it all had to be connected somehow. That afternoon, while doing his chores, Ethan noticed something strange near the barn. There in the fresh snow were paw prints, the same massive prints he'd seen in the forest. The wolf had been here right on their property, possibly during the night. But instead of feeling afraid, Ethan felt a surge of excitement. Later, as darkness fell, he sat at his desk, sketching the wolf from memory in his notebook. The more he drew, the more certain he became that this wasn't just any wolf. There was an intelligence in those eyes that went beyond animal instinct, a purpose in its actions that he couldn't explain. A soft scratch at his window made him jump. Ethan rushed to look out, but saw only darkness and swirling snow. Yet somehow, he knew he wasn't alone. Somewhere out there, in the gathering night, the wolf was watching, waiting, perhaps trying to tell him something important. That night, as he lay in bed, Ethan made a decision. Tomorrow he would go back into the forest. He would find the wolf again, and maybe, just maybe, he would begin to understand the mystery that seemed to be unfolding around their ranch. As if in response to his thoughts, a single howl echoed through the night, closer than ever before, and somehow comforting rather than threatening. What Ethan didn't know was that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his family, their ranch, and the ancient forest that had always been their neighbor. The wolf was only the beginning, the first piece of a puzzle that was far larger and more complex than he could imagine. Sarah's unexpected announcement at breakfast the next morning caught Ethan completely off guard. "Your Aunt Claire is coming to stay with us for a while," she said, studying his reaction over her coffee cup. Ethan nearly choked on his toast. Aunt Claire was his mother's younger sister, a wildlife biologist who traveled the world working on conservation projects. She rarely stayed in one place for more than a few weeks, and her visits to the ranch were usually limited to major holidays. "Why now?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Is something wrong?" Sarah busied herself with clearing the dishes. "Nothing's wrong, she has some work to do in the area." Another careful non-answer that made Ethan's suspicions grow stronger. "Does this have anything to do with the forest?" he pressed, watching his mother's movements carefully. Sarah's hands stilled for just a moment, long enough to confirm his suspicions. "Ethan," she said, turning to face him, "I need you to promise me something. Until Claire arrives, I want you to stay close to the ranch. No more wandering near the forest edge, even for chores. We can adjust the routine temporarily." The request only fueled Ethan's determination to uncover what was happening. But he nodded, knowing that arguing would only make his mother more suspicious. After finishing his morning chores, Ethan retreated to his room, pulling out his grandfather's old journals from under his bed. His father had given them to him years ago, explaining that they contained valuable information about the ranch and the surrounding forest. Until now, Ethan had never felt the need to study them carefully. The leather-bound books were filled with detailed observations about the land, the weather patterns, and most intriguingly, the wildlife. As Ethan flipped through the yellowed pages, something caught his eye. A series of entries from 20 years ago about wolves in the area. "February 15th, he read silently. "Observed the alpha again today. This is no ordinary wolf. The way it watches, the way it moves, there's an intelligence there that defies explanation. Sarah thinks I'm getting too invested in this, but Claire understands. She's seen it too." Ethan's heart raced. Claire had been involved with the wolves before, and his mother knew about it. He continued reading, finding more entries that spoke of a special pack of wolves that had lived in the forest, ones that displayed unusual behavior and intelligence. The sound of a car pulling up to the ranch made Ethan hastily hide the journals. Through his window, he saw a Forest Service vehicle parking next to their truck. A tall man in a ranger's uniform stepped out. Tom Harrison, the same ranger his mother had been talking to on the phone. Staying out of sight, Ethan watched as his mother met Tom on the porch. Their conversation seemed intense, with both of them gesturing toward the forest. Sarah handed Tom something that looked like a map, and he nodded gravely before returning to his vehicle. That afternoon, while collecting eggs from the chicken coop, Ethan heard a familiar sound, a soft whine coming from behind the barn. His heart leaped as he carefully made his way around the structure. There, partially hidden in the shadows, sat the grey wolf. In the daylight, Ethan could see the animal's injury more clearly. The wound on its paw looked painful, though not as severe as he had feared. The wolf watched him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Ethan felt that same strange connection he had experienced in the forest. "Wait here," he whispered, though he felt slightly foolish talking to a wolf. To his amazement, the animal remained still as he hurried to the barn, returning with the first aid kit they kept for the horses. Moving slowly and speaking softly, Ethan approached the wolf. "I want to help you," he said, holding out his hand palm up, the way he would with a nervous horse. The wolf sniffed the air, then gradually extended its injured paw. What happened next defied everything Ethan knew about wild animals. The wolf allowed him to clean and bandage the wound, watching the process with an almost human-like understanding. When he finished, the animal gently pulled its paw back and stood, testing the bandage. "You're welcome," Ethan said softly, and he could have sworn the wolf's eyes sparkled with something like amusement. Then its ears pricked forward, and before Ethan could react, it had vanished around the corner of the barn. Seconds later, he heard his mother calling him from the house. As he walked back, his mind was spinning with questions. The wolf's behavior, his grandfather's journals, Aunt Claire's sudden visit, the ranger's presence, it all had to be connected somehow. That evening, as Ethan helped his mother prepare dinner, he decided to test the waters. "Mum, did Grandpa ever tell you about any special wolves in the forest?" The crash of a dropping plate made him jump. Sarah stood frozen, staring at the broken pieces on the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did you hear about that?" Before Ethan could answer, the phone rang, making them both start. Sarah answered it, her face growing more serious with each passing moment. "Yes, she's arriving tomorrow," she said into the receiver. "No, he doesn't know yet. But Claire thinks, yes, I understand. We'll be ready." As Ethan lay in bed that night, watching the shadows of tree branches dance across his ceiling, he made a list in his mind. Tomorrow, Aunt Claire would arrive. Tomorrow, he might finally get some answers. And tomorrow, he would need to find a way to protect the injured wolf that had somehow chosen to trust him. The distant sound of howling echoed through the night, but this time it was joined by other voices. A chorus of wolves calling to each other across the vast wilderness. Something was changing in the forest, and somehow Ethan knew he was now part of whatever was about to unfold. Aunt Claire's arrival brought more than just her usual whirlwind of energy to the ranch. She pulled up in a mud-splattered SUV loaded with scientific equipment, her trademark red hair wild from the drive, but it was her companion that caught Ethan's attention. A tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses stepped out of the passenger side, carrying a leather briefcase that seemed oddly out of place in their rustic setting. "Dr. Marcus Chen," Claire introduced him, after giving Ethan a tight hug. "He's a colleague from the International Wildlife Conservation Society." The way she emphasized the word colleague made Ethan suspect there was more to the story. Sarah's reaction to Dr. Chen was equally intriguing. She greeted him with the familiarity of an old friend, though Ethan had never heard her mention his name before. As they all moved inside, Ethan noticed how the adults exchanged meaningful glances, speaking in half-sentences that seemed designed to skirt around something important. "The situation has escalated faster than we anticipated," Dr. Chen said, spreading papers across their kitchen table. "The satellite data confirms what we feared." He pointed to a series of maps showing the Shoshone National Forest, with colored markers indicating something Ethan couldn't quite make out. "Ethan, honey," Sarah interrupted, "why don't you go check on the horses? They seemed a bit restless earlier." It was a transparent attempt to get rid of him, but Ethan complied, knowing he could learn more by appearing cooperative. As he left, he heard Claire saying something about genetic markers and unprecedented behavior patterns. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch. Ethan headed toward the barn, but his attention was drawn to movement at the forest's edge. There, partially concealed by the trees, stood the grey wolf. Its bandaged paw seemed to be healing well, and it watched the ranch house with obvious interest. "They're here about you, aren't they?" Ethan whispered, though he was too far away for the wolf to hear. As if in response, the animal's ears twitched, and it turned its amber gaze directly to him. Then deliberately it pawed at the ground twice before disappearing into the forest. Curious, Ethan walked to where the wolf had been standing. There, scratched into the dirt, were marks that couldn't have been made by accident. 2 parallel lines crossed by a diagonal slash. He'd seen similar marks in his grandfather's journal, but hadn't understood their significance until now. The sound of approaching footsteps made him quickly scuff out the marks with his boot. He turned to find Aunt Claire walking toward him, her expression unreadable. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked without preamble. When Ethan hesitated, she added, "The wolf, the big grey one with the unusual eyes." "How did you know?" Claire smiled, but there was worry behind her eyes. "Because I've been tracking this particular pack for years. They're special, Ethan. More special than you can imagine, and now they're in danger." Before she could elaborate, Dr. Chen's voice called from the house. Claire squeezed Ethan's shoulder. "We'll talk more later, but for now be careful. There are people watching these woods who don't understand what they're dealing with." That evening, dinner was a tense affair. The adults spoke in careful generalities about wildlife conservation and forest management, while Ethan picked at his food, his mind racing with questions. He noticed how Dr. Chen kept consulting his phone, frowning at whatever messages he was receiving. After dinner, while helping his mother with the dishes, Ethan overheard a heated conversation from the living room. "The genetic markers are unprecedented," Dr. Chen was saying. "If our theories are correct, this could change everything we know about cognitive evolution in canids." "But if they get to them first," Claire responded, her voice tight with concern, "we'll never know." And after what happened to Richard, the conversation abruptly stopped as Sarah entered the room. Ethan strained to hear more, but they had switched to whispers. Later that night, unable to sleep, Ethan sat at his window, watching the forest. The full moon cast enough light to see the tree line clearly, and he noticed several shapes moving among the shadows. Wolves, more than he'd ever seen near the ranch before. A soft knock at his door made him jump. It was Aunt Claire, still fully dressed despite the late hour. "I saw you watching them," she said, joining him at the window. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" Ethan nodded. "What makes them so special?" Claire was quiet for a long moment. "Have you ever heard of convergent evolution, Ethan? Sometimes, under the right conditions, nature takes unexpected paths. These wolves, they're not just intelligent, they're something else entirely. Something that shouldn't be possible." A howl echoed through the night, followed by another and another. Claire tensed, listening intently. "They're communicating," she whispered. "Not just with each other, but—" She trailed off as a new sound joined the chorus, a different kind of howl, deeper and more complex than the others. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was his wolf, the one he'd helped, but there was something about its call that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "It's starting," Claire murmured, almost to herself. "Sooner than we expected." She turned to Ethan, her expression serious. "Tomorrow I need to show you something. Something your grandfather discovered years ago. But you have to promise me you'll keep it secret, even from your mother." As Claire left his room, Ethan watched the wolf pack melt back into the forest. The grey wolf lingered longest, its eyes reflecting the moonlight like twin flames before it too disappeared. Tomorrow, Ethan knew, would bring answers to some of his questions, but those answers would likely only lead to even deeper mysteries. The pre-dawn light had barely touched the mountains when Aunt Claire shook Ethan awake. She was dressed in hiking gear, with a heavy backpack slung over her shoulder. "Get dressed," she whispered. "Warm clothes, and bring your grandfather's journal." They slipped out of the house while Sarah and Dr. Chen were still asleep. The morning air was crisp, their breath forming clouds in the darkness. Claire led the way toward the forest, following a path Ethan had never noticed before. "Your grandfather wasn't just a rancher," Claire explained as they hiked. "He was also a brilliant naturalist. He observed things about these wolves that nobody else had noticed or wanted to notice." She paused, checking her GPS. "What I'm about to show you, it's what he discovered 30 years ago." They walked for nearly an hour, climbing steadily higher into the mountains. Claire moved with purpose, occasionally consulting both her GPS and a worn leather notebook similar to Ethan's grandfather's journal. Finally, they reached a rocky outcropping that seemed unremarkable at first glance. "Watch your step," Claire cautioned, moving aside some branches to reveal a narrow opening in the rock face. She pulled out a flashlight and ducked inside. Ethan followed, his heart pounding with excitement and nervousness. The passage widened into a small cave, and what Ethan saw made him gasp. The walls were covered with markings, not ancient Native American petroglyphs as he first thought, but something else entirely. Geometric patterns, perfectly straight lines, and symbols that looked almost like writing. "Your grandfather found this place by following the wolves," Claire said softly, running her hand along one of the marks. At first he thought it was an old survey site, or maybe some kind of archaeological find. But then he noticed something extraordinary. She pointed her flashlight at a particular section of wall. The marks there were fresher than the others, and as Ethan looked closer, he recognized the same pattern he'd seen the wolf scratch into the dirt yesterday. "They made these," he whispered in disbelief. Claire nodded. "Not just made them, they're still making them. These marks are a form of communication, Ethan. Far more complex than anything we've ever seen from any non-human species. Your grandfather spent years documenting them, trying to understand their meaning." She pulled out her notebook and showed him pages of carefully copied symbols, along with notes and observations. "We've managed to decode some of it. They're not just random marks, they're sharing information about territory, about pack movements, about dangers. And lately," she hesitated. "What?" "Lately they've been leaving warnings. Something's coming, something that has them concerned enough to change their behavior patterns completely." A sound from the cave entrance made them both turn. There, silhouetted against the morning light, stood the grey wolf. It regarded them calmly, then turned its attention to the wall markings. To Ethan's amazement, it approached one of the fresher sections and, using its uninjured paw, deliberately added a new mark. "Incredible," Claire breathed, quickly sketching the symbol in her notebook. "I've never seen one actually making the marks before. They usually only do it when they think they're alone." The wolf turned to them, and Ethan felt that now familiar sense of intelligence in its gaze. It looked directly at Claire, then at the notebook in her hands, before turning its attention to Ethan. "It knows we're trying to understand," Claire said softly. "This is why your mother's been so protective, Ethan. These wolves, they're not just extraordinary animals. They represent something that could change our entire understanding of animal intelligence. But there are people who would exploit that, who would—" She was interrupted by a distant sound, engines getting closer. The wolf's ears pricked forward, and it let out a low growl. Claire quickly packed her notebook away. "We need to go." "Now." She grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him toward a different tunnel than the one they'd entered through. "There's another way out. Your grandfather mapped all the passages." As they hurried through the narrow tunnel, Ethan could hear voices echoing from the main cave. The wolf had disappeared, but somehow Ethan knew it was still nearby, watching, protecting. They emerged from the tunnel into a small ravine, well hidden from view. Claire checked her GPS again. "We'll take the long way back to the ranch. We can't risk leading them to the cave." "Who are they?" Ethan asked as they began their careful descent. "People who think these wolves should be in a laboratory, not free in the forest. They've been tracking the pack for months, setting up camera traps, trying to capture one for study. But they don't understand. Containment would destroy what makes these wolves special. Their intelligence, their social structure, their ability to communicate. It's all linked to their freedom and their connection to this land." They walked in silence for a while, taking a circuitous route back to the ranch. As they neared home, Claire stopped and turned to Ethan. "There's something else you need to know. Your father—" Before she could finish, they heard Sarah calling from the ranch house. Claire squeezed Ethan's shoulder. "Later," she promised. "But remember, everything you saw today has to remain secret. Even from your mother for now, it's for her own protection." As they walked the final distance to the ranch, Ethan's mind was spinning with questions. The wolf's deliberate marking in the cave, Claire's unfinished sentence about his father, the mysterious people following them. It all pointed to something far bigger than he had imagined. From the forest came a single clear howl, his wolf calling to its pack. Other voices joined in, creating a complex melody that echoed through the mountains. Something was coming, the wolves were trying to tell them, something that would change everything. That afternoon, Dr. Chen's behavior shifted dramatically. After receiving a phone call that sent him pacing around the kitchen, he began unpacking sophisticated electronic equipment from his SUV. Satellite phones, tracking devices, and what looked like military-grade monitoring systems soon covered the dining room table. "We've detected unusual movement patterns," he explained to Sarah and Claire, seemingly forgetting that Ethan was within earshot. "The entire pack is converging on the North Ridge. It's unprecedented behavior for this time of year." "Could they be responding to the intrusion this morning?" Claire asked, spreading out a topographical map. "This is different," Dr. Chen replied, adjusting his glasses. "According to the thermal imaging data, there are at least 30 wolves gathering. It's as if they're preparing for something." Sarah sank into a chair, her face pale. "Just like before," she whispered. "When Richard—" "Mom," Ethan interrupted, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "What happened with Dad? What aren't you telling me?" The adults exchanged glances, and for a moment Ethan thought they would dismiss him again, but Sarah took a deep breath and nodded to Claire, who pulled out her notebook. "Your father didn't just leave for a research expedition, Ethan," Claire began gently. "He's been working undercover, gathering evidence about these wolves and the people trying to capture them. His last message to us indicated he'd discovered something critical about their origins." Before she could continue, one of Dr. Chen's devices emitted a high-pitched beep. He rushed to check it, his expression growing more concerned. "They're on the move again, all of them, and they're heading straight for the ranch." As if on cue, a chorus of howls erupted from the forest, closer than Ethan had ever heard before. He ran to the window, and what he saw made his heart skip a beat. Dozens of wolves were emerging from the tree line, moving with purpose toward the ranch. At their head was the gray wolf, its bandaged paw leaving distinct tracks in the snow. "This isn't aggressive behavior," Dr. Chen observed, watching through binoculars. "Look at their body language, they're trying to tell us something." The gray wolf approached the house, stopping at a safe distance. Behind it, the pack spread out in a perfect semicircle, their formation too precise to be coincidental. Then, to everyone's amazement, the gray wolf began to scratch in the snow, creating complex patterns similar to those Ethan had seen in the cave. "Claire," Dr. Chen called urgently. "Are you recording this?" Claire was already filming with a high-speed camera, her hands shaking slightly. "These patterns, they're different from anything we've documented before. More complex. More urgent." Sarah moved closer to Ethan, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "What are they trying to tell us?" The gray wolf finished its markings and looked directly at the house, its amber eyes seeming to pierce through the window glass. Then, deliberately, it raised its injured paw, showing the bandage Ethan had applied. "It's asking for our help," Ethan realized suddenly. "All of them are." Dr. Chen's satellite phone rang, breaking the tension. His face darkened as he listened. "They're coming," he announced grimly. 3 vehicles just turned onto the Forest Service road. Heavy equipment, probably tranquilizer guns and transport cages. "We can't let them take these wolves," Claire said firmly. "Not after everything we've learned. Not after what Richard sacrificed to protect them." Sarah straightened up, a new determination in her eyes. "Then we won't. Ethan, get your coat. Dr. Chen, bring your tracking equipment. Claire," she paused, managing a small smile. "Just like old times?" Claire nodded, already pulling equipment from her bag. Just like old times. As they prepared to head out, Ethan noticed something strange about the marks the wolf had left in the snow. Unlike the geometric patterns in the cave, these seemed to form a rough map, and at its center was a location he recognized from his grandfather's journals, a place called Echo Canyon. "Mom," he said, pointing to the marks, "I think I know where they want us to go." Sarah studied the pattern, then looked at the wolf pack, still waiting patiently in their perfect formation. "All these years," she murmured, "we thought we were studying them. But they've been studying us too, haven't they? Learning how to communicate with us when the time was right." The gray wolf let out a single, clear howl, a sound that seemed to carry both urgency and hope. The rest of the pack joined in, creating a symphony that echoed off the mountains. As Ethan listened, he understood that this wasn't just about protecting a few remarkable wolves. This was about uncovering a truth that had been hidden in these forests for generations. They had less than an hour before the intruders arrived, less than an hour to follow the wolves to whatever secret they wanted to share, less than an hour to possibly discover what had kept his father away for so long. As they quickly gathered their gear, Ethan caught his mother's eye and saw something there he hadn't seen in years. Not just determination, but excitement. The wolves were already moving, heading toward the northern ridge. Whatever they wanted to show them was waiting in Echo Canyon, and somehow Ethan knew that once they saw it, nothing would ever be the same again. The trek to Echo Canyon was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. The wolf pack moved in precise formations around them, with smaller groups breaking off to patrol the perimeter, while the main body guided them forward. The grey wolf stayed close to Ethan, occasionally looking back as if to ensure they were following the right path. "They're protecting us," Dr. Chen observed, checking his thermal imaging device, creating a moving security perimeter. "The level of coordination is extraordinary." Sarah led the way, her familiarity with the terrain evident in every sure-footed step. Claire walked beside her, both women occasionally exchanging glances that suggested they'd done this before. The sense that there was still so much Ethan didn't know about his family's history grew stronger with each passing minute. "Mom," he called out, hurrying to catch up with her. "How long have you known about these wolves?" Sarah's pace didn't slow, but her expression softened. "Since before you were born. Your father and we were part of the original research team that first documented their unusual behavior. That's how we met." "Your mother was the first to suggest they might be using symbolic communication," Claire added. Nobody believed her at first. Except Richard. A sharp bark from the grey wolf interrupted their conversation. The pack's formation had changed, becoming more concentrated. Dr. Chen consulted his equipment again, frowning. "The vehicles we detected are changing course," he reported. "They're trying to circle around to cut us off from the canyon." "They don't know these mountains like we do," Sarah replied, her voice confident. "Or like they do." She nodded toward the wolves who were already adjusting their route, leading them through a narrow passage between two rock formations. The path grew steeper and the snow deeper. Ethan noticed that the wolves were deliberately creating a packed trail for them to follow, making their progress easier. The level of intelligence and cooperation he was witnessing seemed almost impossible. "Look," Claire whispered suddenly, pointing to a series of marks in the rock wall beside them. They were similar to those in the cave, but weathered by time and the elements. "These markings, they're decades old, maybe even older." "They've been here all along," Dr. Chen mused, photographing the symbols. Generation after generation passing down knowledge, creating a written record of their existence. The scientific implications are staggering. The grey wolf appeared beside them, pawing at the ground impatiently. Its meaning was clear. They needed to keep moving. As they climbed higher, the wind carried sounds from below, distant engine noises and human voices. The wolf pack's formation tightened further, and their pace increased. "We're almost there," Sarah announced, her breath visible in the cold air. "Echo Canyon is just ahead." Richard's last message. He said there was something there we needed to see, something that would explain everything. They crested a ridge and Echo Canyon spread out before them. The sight made them all stop in their tracks. The canyon walls were covered in markings, thousands of them, stretching as far as they could see. But it wasn't just the quantity that was shocking, it was the organization. The symbols were arranged in clear patterns, like pages in a book. "It's a library," Claire breathed, her eyes wide. "They've been recording their history, their knowledge, everything they've learned about us and their world." The grey wolf led them to a specific section of the wall where the markings were fresher. As they watched, it began to scratch new symbols into the rock, its movements precise and deliberate. "It's the same pattern they showed us at the ranch," Ethan realized. "But there's more to it now." "Doctor." Chen's satellite phone crackled to life. "They've split into 3 groups," a voice reported, "heading up all possible access routes to the canyon." "Let them come," Sarah said firmly. "They need to see this. They need to understand what they're dealing with." The grey wolf finished its markings and stepped back, looking at Ethan expectantly. As he studied the symbols, Something clicked in his mind. He pulled out his grandfather's journal, flipping to a specific page. "Look," he said, holding up the journal. "Grandpa documented these same symbols 20 years ago. He was trying to translate them." He pointed to a particular sequence. "This one appears over and over." He thought it meant guardian or protector. Sarah took the journal, her hands trembling slightly. Richard's last message. He said he'd found evidence of an ancient partnership, that these wolves weren't just intelligent, they were custodians of something important, something they've been protecting for generations. The wolf pack had spread out around the canyon, taking up defensive positions. The grey wolf remained with them, watching as they began to document the markings. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. "Whatever your father discovered," Claire said, her camera recording everything, "whatever these wolves have been trying to tell us, we're about to find out. And those people coming up the mountain, they're about to learn that some secrets of nature aren't meant to be captured or controlled." Ethan looked at the grey wolf, remembering their first meeting, the trust it had shown him, the way it had led them here. This wasn't just about protecting a species or making a scientific discovery. This was about understanding a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for generations. The wolf's amber eyes met his, and in that moment Ethan felt a connection that transcended the barrier between species. Whatever happened next would change not just their lives, but our understanding of the relationship between humans and the natural world forever. Dr. Chen's equipment began picking up multiple signals as the intruders' vehicles drew closer to Echo Canyon. The wolf pack remained calm but alert, their formation shifting subtly to create a protective barrier around the marked walls. The grey wolf stood beside Ethan, its presence both reassuring and purposeful. "Claire," Sarah called urgently, "look at this section." She was studying a particularly dense collection of symbols near ground level. "These marks, they're different from the others, more like mathematical equations," Claire finished, her voice filled with wonder. "Look at the repeating patterns, the geometric progressions. They're not just recording events, they're documenting scientific principles." Dr. Chen adjusted his glasses, his scientific skepticism warring with the evidence before his eyes. "But that would mean they understand far more than we ever imagined," Sarah completed. Richard was right. These wolves aren't just intelligent, they're carriers of knowledge that's been accumulated and passed down through generations. A sharp bark from one of the sentinel wolves drew their attention. The grey wolf's ears pricked forward, and it quickly scratched a new series of marks in the snow. The pattern was urgent, almost frantic. "They're trying to tell us something specific," Ethan said, comparing the new marks to those in his grandfather's journal. "Look, this symbol keeps repeating. The one Grandpa thought meant guardian, but there's more to it now." Sarah studied the marks intensely, her expression changing from confusion to sudden understanding. "Not just guardian," she whispered. "The full phrase is guardians of the ancient knowledge. They're not just protecting territory or themselves, they're protecting information. Scientific knowledge that's been preserved here for who knows how long." The sound of engines grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of tires on snow. The wolf pack's formation tightened, but they showed no signs of aggression. Instead, they seemed to be waiting, watching. "Mom," Ethan said suddenly, "what if this is what Dad discovered? What if this is why he's been away?" Before Sarah could respond, bright floodlights illuminated the canyon. 3 large vehicles had arrived, their headlights cutting through the falling snow. Men in tactical gear began emerging, carrying what looked like tranquilizer rifles and capture equipment. The lead vehicle's door opened and a tall figure stepped out. Everyone tensed, but the grey wolf's reaction was unexpected. Instead of growling or retreating, it took several steps forward, its tail held high. "Don't move," Sarah called to the approaching men. "You need to see this first. You need to understand what you're dealing with." The tall figure paused, then lowered his hood. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. Standing before them, looking weathered but very much alive, was his father. "Richard," Sarah breathed, her voice catching. "I'm sorry for the deception," Richard said, moving closer, "but I had to be sure. Had to know who was really behind the attempts to capture them." He gestured to the men behind him. "These aren't hunters or poachers. They're from the International Wildlife Protection Agency. We've been working undercover, tracking the real threats to the pack. The grey wolf approached Richard confidently, touching its nose to his hand in greeting. "This one," Richard said, smiling at Ethan, "has been keeping me informed about all of you. Especially you, son. The trust you showed in helping him, it proved everything we've been working toward." "The markings," Claire interrupted, her camera still recording. "Are you found out what they really mean?" Richard nodded, his expression serious. "They're not just communications or historical records, they're scientific data, physics, astronomy, mathematics, preserved and passed down through generations of wolves who developed ways to understand and document complex natural principles. These wolves aren't just intelligent animals, they're the custodians of knowledge that predates human civilization in these mountains." The wolf pack had relaxed slightly, but maintained their protective formation around the canyon walls. The grey wolf moved between Ethan and Richard, looking from one to the other as if confirming their connection. "But why all the secrecy?" Sarah asked, her voice mixing relief and frustration. "Why stay away so long?" "Because there are others looking for them," Richard explained grimly. "People who would exploit this discovery, who would turn these remarkable beings into research subjects or worse. We needed to make sure we had enough evidence, enough protection in place before revealing the truth." The grey wolf suddenly tensed, its attention turning to the forest below. Other wolves took up alert positions, their behavior indicating approaching danger. "They're coming," Richard said urgently. "The real threat. The ones who've been setting traps trying to capture them for study. And now we're all here, exactly where they want us." Ethan looked at the wolf beside him, understanding flooding through him. The pack hadn't just led them here to show them the markings. They'd brought them here because they needed their help, needed all of them, working together to protect something far more precious than anyone had imagined. The sound of more vehicles approaching echoed through the canyon. The wolves began to move with purpose, taking up strategic positions. Whatever was coming, they were ready to face it, not as wild animals, but as intelligent beings defending something precious that had been entrusted to their care for countless generations. The new vehicles that appeared through the swirling snow were different, sleek black SUVs with tinted windows and no identifying marks. They moved with military precision, surrounding the canyon's entrance in a coordinated pattern. "Blackstone Research Group," Richard said grimly, recognizing the formation. "A private company that specializes in acquiring unique biological specimens. They've been following my trail for months." The grey wolf pressed closer to Ethan, its fur bristling. Around them, the pack moved with incredible coordination, creating defensive positions that seemed almost strategically planned. "Doctor." Chen's equipment beeped urgently. "More vehicles approaching from the North Ridge," he reported. "They're trying to box us in." "Not just us," Claire added, studying the wolves' movements. "Look at how they're positioning themselves. They're protecting specific sections of the wall, the ones with the most complex markings." Richard nodded, pulling equipment from his vehicle. "Those sections contain the most important information. Mathematical principles, astronomical observations, even what appears to be quantum theory, all recorded and preserved in ways we're only beginning to understand." A figure emerged from the lead black vehicle, a woman in an expensive winter coat, her silver hair pulled back severely. "Dr. Mitchell," she called out to Richard, her voice carrying across the snow. "How nice of you to finally lead us to your discovery." "Dr. Victoria Blackstone," Richard muttered to the others. "Brilliant scientist, ruthless businesswoman. She's been trying to capture one of these wolves for study for years. The world needs to know about this remarkable breakthrough," Dr. Blackstone continued, gesturing to her team to spread out. "Imagine the advances we could make by studying these creatures in a controlled environment." The grey wolf let out a low growl, and the sound was echoed by the entire pack. But it wasn't just noise. There was a pattern to it, a complexity that made everyone, even Dr. Blackstone's team, pause. "They're not your specimens to study," Sarah called out, stepping forward. "They're intelligent beings who've been protecting knowledge that's beyond our current understanding." Ethan watched as the grey wolf began scratching in the snow again, but this time the marks were different, more complex, more urgent. He compared them to his grandfather's journal, and suddenly the connection clicked. "Dad," he said urgently, "look at this. It's not just a warning, it's instructions." Richard studied the marks, his eyes widening. "Of course," he breathed. "They're not just showing us what they know, they're showing us how to protect it." Dr. Blackstone's team was moving closer, their tranquilizer rifles raised. "This is bigger than your family's personal attachment to these animals," she called out. "Think of the possibilities, the scientific advances, the evolutionary insights." "That's exactly what we are thinking about," Claire interrupted, her camera recording everything. "But you're missing the point. They're not research subjects, they're teachers." The grey wolf suddenly stood tall, its presence commanding attention. To everyone's amazement, it began to move with deliberate purpose, marking out a complex series of symbols that spiraled outward in the snow. Other wolves joined in, each adding to the pattern with incredible precision. "It's beautiful," Dr. Chen whispered, his scientific skepticism finally crumbling. "They're creating a mathematical proof right in front of us." Dr. Blackstone had paused, her expression shifting from determination to uncertainty as she watched the wolves work. The pattern they were creating was undeniably intelligent, purposeful, and far beyond what any animal should be capable of. "The real discovery," Richard said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear, "isn't just their intelligence. It's the fact that they've been preserving and passing down knowledge for generations, waiting for humans who were ready to understand it properly." The grey wolf finished its part of the pattern and looked directly at Ethan. In its amber eyes, he saw not just intelligence but wisdom and a request for trust. "They're offering to teach us," Ethan realized aloud, "but only if we respect their freedom, their way of life." The pattern in the snow was complete now, and even Dr. Blackstone's team had lowered their weapons, transfixed by what they were seeing. The wolves had created a perfect geometric demonstration of principles that modern science was only beginning to grasp. "Victoria," Richard called out, his voice firm but reasonable, "you can be part of this, but not as a captor, as a student. They're willing to share their knowledge, but only with those who approach them with respect and understanding." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind through the canyon and the soft sounds of the wolves moving through the snow. The choice before them was clear. They could either try to capture and study these remarkable beings, potentially destroying the very thing that made them special, or they could learn from them as willing teachers. Dr. Blackstone took a step forward, her expression unreadable. The grey wolf watched her intently, its intelligent eyes seeming to peer into her soul. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of the wolf pack, but possibly the future of human understanding itself. Dr. Blackstone stood motionless in the snow, her calculating gaze moving from the mathematical pattern the wolves had created to the ancient markings on the canyon walls. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited for her decision. 30 years of research," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of wonder beneath its professional exterior. "I've dedicated my life to studying extraordinary adaptations in species, but this," she gestured to the complex pattern in the snow, "this is beyond anything we could have imagined." The grey wolf took a deliberate step toward her, its movement careful but purposeful. Behind it, the pack maintained their protective formation around the canyon walls, but their posture was alert rather than aggressive. "They're giving you a chance," Ethan said, surprised by his own boldness in addressing the powerful scientist. "Just like they gave me a chance when I found him injured." Dr. Blackstone turned to him, her expression softening slightly. "You helped this one?" "He trusted me," Ethan replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "And now they're trusting us, all of us, with something much bigger." Richard moved forward, standing beside his son. "Victoria, think about what this really means. These wolves haven't just developed intelligence. They've created a system for preserving and transmitting complex knowledge across generations. They're not specimens to be studied in a lab. They're the keepers of information that could revolutionize our understanding of the natural world." The grey wolf let out a soft sound, almost like a purr, and began adding to the pattern in the snow. The new marks were different, more like the symbols Ethan had seen in his grandfather's journal. "Look at this," Claire called excitedly, her camera focused on the wolf's movements. "These symbols, they're combining the ancient markings with the mathematical proof. They're showing us how it's all connected." Dr. Chen's scientific equipment was recording everything, his displays showing readings that seemed to defy explanation. The complexity of their communication. It's not just about the symbols, there are layers of meaning we're only beginning to grasp. Sarah stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Dr. Blackstone, you have a choice here. You can try to capture them, to study them in captivity, and lose everything that makes them extraordinary. Or you can be part of something revolutionary, a partnership between species, learning from each other. The wolf pack had begun moving in a coordinated pattern, each animal adding to the demonstration in the snow. The result was a stunning display of mathematical and scientific principles expressed through a combination of movement, markings, and coordinated behavior. The International Wildlife Protection Agency is prepared to designate this entire area as a protected research sanctuary, Richard added. A place where scientists like yourself could work with the wolves on their terms, learning what they have to teach us. Dr. Blackstone watched as the grey wolf completed another series of marks, its movements precise and deliberate. The pattern now covered a significant area of the snow-covered ground, each part connecting to create a whole that was both beautiful and profound. A partnership, she mused, her professional facade cracking to reveal genuine wonder. Not subjects and observers, but students and teachers. She turned to her team, who were still standing with their weapons lowered, equally transfixed by the wolves' display. The grey wolf approached her again, this time stopping just a few feet away. It looked up at her with those remarkable amber eyes, and in that moment, something shifted in Dr. Blackstone's expression. "Stand down," she ordered her team. "Put everything away." She turned to Richard. "You're right. I've been so focused on studying them that I missed the bigger picture. They're not just intelligent animals, they're the custodians of knowledge we haven't even begun to understand." The tension in the air dissipated as Dr. Blackstone's team began returning their equipment to their vehicles. The wolf pack maintained their positions, but their posture relaxed slightly. "We'll need to establish protocols," Dr. Blackstone continued, her scientist's mind already adapting to the new paradigm. "Ways to document and study their knowledge while respecting their autonomy. And we'll need to protect this place." The grey wolf returned to Ethan's side, and he felt a surge of pride. This remarkable creature hadn't just trusted him with its injury. It had trusted humans with something far more precious, the chance to learn from a wisdom that had been preserved in these mountains for generations. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered canyon, Ethan realized that this wasn't just about protecting a special pack of wolves. It was about bridging the gap between two species, about learning to see intelligence and wisdom in forms we had never expected. And somehow he knew this was just the beginning. The following days at Echo Canyon brought changes that no one could have predicted. Dr. Blackstone, true to her word, had not only withdrawn her capture teams, but had thrown the full weight of her organization's resources behind protecting the site. The International Wildlife Protection Agency had declared the entire area a restricted research sanctuary, with Richard appointed as lead coordinator. Ethan watched in amazement as a transformation took place. Small, unobtrusive observation posts were established at strategic points, designed to blend seamlessly with the natural environment. Scientists from around the world began arriving, each carefully vetted by both the protection agency and, remarkably, the wolves themselves. "They can sense intention," Dr. Chen explained one morning, as they watched the grey wolf evaluate a newly arrived researcher. "They know who's here to learn and who might have other motives." The wolf pack had maintained their presence around the canyon, but their behavior had shifted. Instead of just protecting the marked walls, they were actively participating in the research, demonstrating complex concepts through their movements and markings. "Look at this," Claire called out, excitement in her voice. She was studying a new series of marks the wolves had created overnight. "They're not just showing us existing knowledge, they're responding to our questions, they're teaching us." Sarah and Richard had set up a small command center in one of the observation posts, coordinating the various research teams while ensuring the wolves' territory remained protected. Ethan noticed how his parents worked together seamlessly, as if the years apart had never happened. "Your father's disappearance," Sarah explained to him one evening, "it was all about protecting this. He discovered that Blackstone wasn't the only one interested in the wolves. There were others with far less ethical intentions. And now, Ethan asked, watching the grey wolf lead a group of its pack members through another complex demonstration. Now we have a chance to do this right, Richard replied, joining them, to learn from them while protecting their way of life. It's what your grandfather always hoped for. The grey wolf had become something of a bridge between the species, often seeking out Ethan when new information needed to be shared. Its injured paw had healed completely, but the trust formed during that first encounter had grown into something remarkable. One morning, as dawn painted the canyon walls in soft pink light, Ethan found himself alone with the wolf near the original markings. The animal began scratching in the frost-covered ground, creating a pattern he'd never seen before. "Dad!" he called out excitedly. "Claire, you need to see this." They hurried over, cameras and notebooks ready. The wolf was creating something extraordinary, a series of interconnected symbols that seemed to describe celestial movements and mathematical principles far beyond current scientific understanding. "It's not just about the mathematics," Claire breathed, studying the marks. "Look at how the symbols connect. They're showing us relationships we never knew existed between different natural phenomena." Dr. Blackstone, who had remained at the site as lead scientist, approached carefully. The wolf acknowledged her presence with a slight nod before continuing its demonstration. "In all my years of research," she admitted, "I never imagined I'd be learning advanced scientific principles from another species. And to think we almost—" She trailed off, shaking her head at the memory of their near-disastrous first encounter. The wolf finished its markings and looked up at them expectantly. Ethan had learned to read its expressions over the past days, and he could see the intelligence and patience in its amber eyes. "They're not just teaching us about science," he realized aloud. "They're teaching us about coexistence, about respecting different forms of intelligence and wisdom." Sarah smiled, putting an arm around his shoulders. "Your grandfather used to say something similar. He believed these wolves were proof that there were different kinds of intelligence in the world, if we just learned to recognize them." The morning light strengthened, illuminating the canyon walls and the thousands of marks that generations of wolves had left there. Each symbol, each pattern, was part of a larger story, a story of knowledge preserved and passed down, waiting for the right moment to be shared. "We're establishing a permanent research station," Richard announced, watching the wolf pack move through their morning routines. "But with a difference. Instead of us dictating the terms, we'll let them guide the process. They've been the guardians of this knowledge for generations. Now they can be our teachers." The grey wolf let out a soft bark, almost like a laugh, before trotting off to join its pack. As Ethan watched it go, he realized that their lives had changed forever. The ranch, the forest, the wolves. It was all part of something bigger than any of them had imagined. Claire was already documenting the new markings, her excitement evident in every movement. "These symbols," she said, "they're not just about the past. They're showing us possibilities for the future, ways of understanding the natural world that we've never considered." The morning sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. In those shadows, wolves and humans moved together, each learning from the other, each part of a new chapter in the story of Echo Canyon. And somewhere in the ancient walls, in the countless marks left by generations of wolves, lay more secrets waiting to be discovered. 1 month after the momentous events at Echo Canyon, the transformation was complete. The once quiet wilderness had become a unique center of learning, where the boundary between teacher and student, human and wolf, had blurred in ways no one could have predicted. The grey wolf, now known among the researchers as Alpha Scholar, due to its role in leading the knowledge-sharing sessions, had developed an even deeper bond with Ethan. Together, they had become instrumental in bridging the communication gap between species. "It's remarkable, Doctor," Blackstone observed one afternoon, watching Ethan and the wolf work with a team of mathematicians. "The way they interact, it's as if they've developed their own language." Sarah nodded, pride evident in her expression. "Ethan has his grandfather's gift for understanding them. He sees beyond the obvious, just like Richard always did." The research station had been carefully designed to minimize its impact on the wolves' territory. Solar-powered equipment hummed quietly, collecting data as the pack demonstrated principles that challenged conventional scientific understanding. The wolves moved between the ancient canyon walls with purpose, their every movement part of a larger educational process. "Look at this latest sequence," Claire called out, excitement in her voice. She was reviewing footage of a morning session where the pack had demonstrated what appeared to be an entirely new approach to understanding gravitational fields. They're not just sharing existing knowledge, they're actively developing new theories. Dr. Chen, who had relocated his entire research operation to Echo Canyon, was working with a team to create a comprehensive database of the wolves' markings. "The complexity of their system is staggering," he explained to a group of visiting scientists. "Each generation has added to the knowledge, refined it, expanded it." The grey wolf appeared at Ethan's side, gently nudging him toward a newly discovered section of markings on the canyon wall. As they approached, other wolves joined them, creating a formation that had become familiar to the researchers. It was time for a new lesson. "Dad!" Ethan called out, recognizing the significance of the moment. "They want to show us something new." Richard hurried over, followed by Sarah, Claire, and Dr. Blackstone. The wolf pack had arranged themselves in a semicircle, with the grey wolf at the center. What followed was an extraordinary demonstration of coordinated movement and marking making that left even the most skeptical scientists speechless. "They're describing quantum entanglement, Doctor." Blackstone whispered, her voice filled with awe. "But in a way I've never seen before. The principles are the same, but their understanding of it's completely different from our mathematical models." The grey wolf worked methodically, its markings precise and deliberate. Other wolves added their own contributions, building on each other's work in a display of collective intelligence that defied conventional understanding. "It's not just about the science," Ethan realized, watching the intricate dance of knowledge sharing unfold before them. "They're showing us how everything is connected, the mathematics, the physics, the natural world. It's all part of one big picture." Sarah squeezed his shoulder, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your grandfather used to say that true wisdom comes from understanding these connections." He would have loved to see this. As the demonstration continued, more researchers gathered to watch. The wolves seemed to take pride in their role as teachers, each one contributing to the collective sharing of knowledge in its own way. "We're establishing something unprecedented here," Richard announced to the assembled group. "Not just a research station, but a true partnership between species. A place where different forms of intelligence can come together to expand our understanding of the universe." Dr. Blackstone, who had once sought to capture these remarkable creatures, now stood in quiet amazement as they freely shared insights that would revolutionize multiple fields of science. "I was so wrong about them," she admitted softly. "They're not specimens to be studied. They're colleagues, teachers, partners in discovery." The grey wolf completed its demonstration and turned to Ethan, its amber eyes glowing with intelligence and trust. In that moment, Ethan understood that he was part of something much bigger than himself, a bridge between two worlds, helping to facilitate an exchange of knowledge that had the potential to change everything. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon walls, the wolves and humans continued their work together. The ancient markings, preserved for generations by these remarkable creatures, were slowly revealing their secrets, offering new ways of understanding the world and humanity's place in it. The story of Echo Canyon and its extraordinary inhabitants had only begun to unfold, but already it was clear that this unique partnership between species would leave an indelible mark on the future of scientific understanding. 6 months after the establishment of the Echo Canyon Research Center, the impact of the wolves' knowledge was beginning to ripple through the scientific community. What had started as a local discovery had grown into something that was quietly revolutionizing multiple fields of study. The grey wolf, still Ethan's constant companion, had taken on an even more prominent role in the knowledge exchange. Together, they had developed a system of communication that went beyond simple symbols and markings, incorporating subtle body language and vocalizations that added layers of meaning to the wolves' teachings. "The implications are staggering," Dr. Blackstone explained to a select committee of international scientists who had been cleared to visit the site. "Their understanding of natural phenomena isn't just advanced, it's fundamentally different from our approach, offering perspectives we never considered." Sarah and Richard had transformed the old ranch house into a welcome center for visiting researchers, while maintaining their home in a small cabin nearby. The wolves regularly patrolled the expanded territory, seamlessly integrating their traditional role as guardians with their new position as teachers. "Watch this," Claire called out one morning as the pack gathered for what had become a daily ritual of knowledge sharing. The grey wolf was leading a demonstration that combined movement, markings, and synchronized pack behavior to illustrate complex principles of quantum mechanics. "They're not just teaching us facts," Ethan observed, sitting cross-legged in the snow as he watched the demonstration unfold. "They're showing us how to think differently about everything we thought we knew." Dr. Chen, who had been compiling a comprehensive database of the wolves' teaching methods, nodded in agreement. Their approach to problem-solving is holistic. They see connections we miss because we're too focused on individual components. The grey wolf paused in its demonstration to approach Ethan, touching its nose gently to his hand in what had become a familiar gesture of partnership. The trust between them had deepened into something that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. "You know," Sarah said softly, watching the interaction, "your grandfather's last journal entry spoke about a day when we would learn to see the world through their eyes. I think he knew this was possible, even then." Richard, who had been reviewing new data with a team of physicists, joined them. The breakthrough in quantum field theory we announced last week, it came directly from their teaching. They've understood these principles for generations, just expressed them differently. The Wolfpack had begun a new demonstration, this one even more complex than the last. The patterns they created in the snow, combined with their coordinated movements, described astronomical phenomena in ways that challenged conventional models. "Look at how they're showing the relationship between gravity and time, Doctor," Blackstone exclaimed, her scientific detachment giving way to genuine excitement. "It's so elegant, so simple when you see it their way." Ethan watched as the grey wolf added the final marks to the demonstration, its movements precise and purposeful. He had learned to read these symbols as easily as written words, understanding not just their literal meaning, but the deeper principles they conveyed. "They're not just sharing information," he realized aloud. "They're teaching us their way of seeing the world, a perspective that's been refined and passed down through countless generations." Claire, who had been documenting everything, lowered her camera with a thoughtful expression. "It makes you wonder what other forms of intelligence exist out there, just waiting for us to learn how to recognize them." The afternoon sun filtered through the canyon walls, illuminating the ancient markings that had started it all. Researchers moved quietly among the wolves, each species now comfortable with the other's presence, each contributing to a growing body of shared knowledge. "We're establishing something unprecedented here," Richard said, pride evident in his voice. "Not just a research center, but a new way of thinking about intelligence, about knowledge, about our place in the natural world." The grey wolf let out a soft sound, almost like a purr, and pressed against Ethan's side. In its amber eyes, he saw not just intelligence but wisdom, the accumulated understanding of countless generations, finally being shared with those who had learned to listen. As day turned to evening, the canyon filled with the soft sounds of wolves and humans working together, each learning from the other, each part of a partnership that was redefining what was possible when different forms of intelligence came together in mutual respect and understanding. The legacy of Echo Canyon was growing, not just in the scientific breakthroughs it produced, but in the way it was changing how humans viewed their relationship with the natural world. And at the heart of it all was a pack of extraordinary wolves who had chosen to share their ancient wisdom with those who had finally learned to see them for what they truly were, not just intelligent animals, but keepers of knowledge that could change the world. 1 year after the discovery of Echo Canyon's remarkable secret, Ethan stood at the edge of the research center, watching the sun rise over the mountains. The grey wolf sat beside him, their shared silence comfortable and familiar. In the valley below, the lights of the expanded facility twinkled in the pre-dawn darkness, a testament to how much had changed. "Sometimes," Ethan said softly to his companion, "I still can't believe how it all started with a simple act of trust. You, injured and needing help, and me, just trying to do the right thing." The wolf's amber eyes met his, filled with the intelligence and wisdom that had transformed not just their lives, but the scientific world's understanding of animal consciousness and knowledge preservation. Sarah and Richard emerged from their cabin, coffee mugs in hand, to join their morning ritual of watching the pack's dawn demonstration. The wolves had developed a schedule that balanced their natural behaviors with their role as teachers, and these early morning sessions had become legendary among researchers for their insight and complexity. The latest paper on their mathematical principles has been accepted by the International Journal of Theoretical Physics, Richard announced proudly. The peer review committee called it revolutionary. Dr. Blackstone, who had become one of the wolves' most devoted students, arrived with her usual stack of notebooks. Their latest demonstrations on quantum entanglement have completely transformed our understanding of particle physics, she added, her former ambition for capture and control now transformed into genuine respect and wonder. The wolf pack began their morning routine, moving with grace and purpose as they laid out new patterns in the fresh snow. The grey wolf left Ethan's side to join them, taking its place as lead teacher in what had become a daily exchange of knowledge between species. "Look at this," Claire called excitedly, her camera capturing every detail. "They're building on yesterday's lesson about gravitational fields, but adding something new. See how they're connecting it to electromagnetic theory." Dr. Chen, whose database of wolf-taught principles had become a cornerstone of multiple scientific disciplines, nodded appreciatively. Their ability to show relationships between seemingly disparate natural phenomena continues to amaze me. The research center had grown, but carefully, respectfully, always with the wolves' guidance in its development. Small groups of vetted scientists came and went, each contributing to the growing body of knowledge, while learning the wolves' ways of seeing and understanding the world. As the demonstration concluded, the grey wolf returned to Ethan's side. Together, they walked to the ancient wall of markings where it had all begun. New symbols had been added over the past year, the wolves continuing their generations-old tradition of recording and preserving knowledge. "You know," Sarah said, joining them at the wall, "your grandfather's last journal entry spoke about a future where humans would learn to see beyond their own limited perspective of intelligence. He believed that true wisdom could come from the most unexpected sources." "He was right," Richard added, putting an arm around his wife's shoulders. "These wolves haven't just taught us about science. They've taught us about trust, about patience, about seeing the world in ways we never imagined possible." The morning light filled the canyon, illuminating the countless markings that told the story of a knowledge preserved and passed down through generations of remarkable beings who had waited for humans to be ready to learn from them. "We're just beginning to understand," Ethan said softly, running his hand along the ancient symbols. "There's so much more to learn." The grey wolf pressed against his side, letting out a soft sound of agreement. In its eyes, Ethan saw the same excitement for discovery, the same joy in sharing knowledge that he felt. They had become true partners in an unprecedented journey of understanding. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground, the wolves and humans of Echo Canyon continued their shared work. Each day brought new insights, new understanding, and new appreciation for the remarkable partnership that had grown from a simple act of kindness in the snow. The legacy of trust built between a boy and a wolf had grown into something that would change the world's understanding of intelligence, knowledge, and the profound connections that exist between all living beings. And in the heart of the Shoshone National Forest, the ancient wisdom of the wolf pack continued to be shared with those who had learned to listen, to observe, and to understand. Dear listeners, we hope the extraordinary tale of Ethan and the wolves of Echo Canyon has touched your hearts and opened your minds to new possibilities. This story of trust, discovery, and the breaking of barriers between species is just one of many remarkable narratives we have to share. If you've been moved by this journey of understanding and wonder, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. By joining our community, you'll have access to more unique stories that challenge our perspectives and expand our understanding of the world around us. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what this story meant to you. And don't forget to click the notification bell to be the first to know when we release our next adventure into the extraordinary. So until then, remember that wisdom and intelligence can be found in the most unexpected places, if we only learn to look with open hearts and minds.